The North Atlantic roars in the darkness of 1942. Somewhere beneath those freezing waves, a German U-boat glides silently toward a convoy of merchant ships. The crew inside checks their instruments, confident in their vessel's engineering. They have no idea that a tiny, ingenious device planted weeks ago in a German shipyard is counting down to their destruction. Within hours, this submarine will implode from within, its hull breached not by depth charges or torpedoes, but by a weapon so cunning that the German High Command will never fully understand what happened. This is the story of Britain's most secretive sabotage campaign, a shadow war fought not on battlefields, but in factories, dockyards, and the very heart of Nazi Germany's industrial machine. If you find yourself drawn into this hidden chapter of the Second World War, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Stories like these deserve to be told, and your support makes that possible. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. From the first day of the conflict in September 1939 until Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied and Axis forces clashed across millions of square miles of ocean. At stake was nothing less than Britain's survival. As an island nation, the United Kingdom depended entirely on maritime trade for its food, fuel, and war materials. Nearly 90% of everything Britain needed to fight, and simply to exist, arrived by ship. Winston Churchill would later confess that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Germany understood this vulnerability with crystal clarity. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine submarine fleet, devised a strategy of strangulation. His U-boats would hunt in coordinated groups called wolf packs, overwhelming convoy escorts and sending Allied merchant ships to the bottom at a rate faster than British and American shipyards could replace them. In the darkest months of the campaign, the math was horrifying. German submarines were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them, and trained merchant sailors were dying faster than they could be replaced. The conventional response to this threat involved surface escorts, aircraft patrols, depth charges, and eventually sophisticated weapons like the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar, which could throw patterns of contact-fused bombs ahead of a hunting ship. These measures helped, but they were reactive. They engaged U-boats only after those submarines had already reached the hunting grounds. What if there was another way? What if the submarines could be crippled or destroyed before they ever left port? What if the war against the U-boats could be fought not in the Atlantic, but in the shipyards and factories of Germany itself? This was the challenge presented to one of the most secretive organizations in British history. The Special Operations Executive, known simply as SOE, had been created in July 1940 on Churchill's direct orders. His instruction was famously blunt: set Europe ablaze. SOE's mission was to conduct espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe, supporting local resistance movements and striking at German war production from within. The organization recruited engineers, chemists, linguists, and individuals with specialized knowledge of enemy industry. Among their many targets, German submarine production quickly rose to the top of the priority list. The U-boat threat demanded unconventional solutions. Bombing raids against submarine pens had proven largely ineffective. The Germans had constructed massive, reinforced concrete shelters over their submarine bases in occupied France at places like Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Brest, and La Pallice. These structures had walls and roofs made of concrete several meters thick, capable of withstanding even the heaviest bombs of the era. Allied aircraft dropped thousands of tons of explosives on these facilities, devastating the surrounding French towns while leaving the submarine pens largely intact. The U-boats sheltered inside emerged unscathed to resume their deadly patrols. If the submarines could not be destroyed in their hardened shelters, perhaps they could be attacked during construction, or during the vulnerable period when they were being fitted out and prepared for sea. This required penetrating the German industrial complex itself, a task of extraordinary difficulty. Germany's shipyards were heavily guarded, populated by workers who were either loyal Nazis or too terrified of the Gestapo to consider resistance. Yet SOE operatives and resistance networks began mapping these facilities, identifying vulnerabilities, and devising methods of attack. The weapon that emerged from SOE's laboratories was deceptively simple in appearance. Known by various code names during the war, it would later be recognized as one of the most effective sabotage devices ever created. The limpet mine was a compact explosive charge designed to be attached magnetically to the hull of a ship. Its name derived from the limpet, a type of marine mollusk that clings tenaciously to rocks and ship hulls. The standard British limpet mine contained roughly 2 kilograms of plastic explosive, enough to blow a substantial hole in a ship's steel plating. A timing mechanism allowed the saboteur to set the device and withdraw before detonation. The magnets were powerful enough to grip through layers of marine growth and paint, holding the charge firmly in place even on a moving vessel. But the limpet mine, while useful for attacking ships in harbor, presented obvious difficulties when targeting submarines in heavily defended German installations. Swimmers approaching these facilities faced searchlights, patrol boats, and armed guards. The chances of successful attachment were low, and the chances of the saboteur surviving to escape were even lower. Something more subtle was required. SOE's scientists and engineers worked in secret research facilities scattered across Britain. Their mission was to create devices that could evade detection, that could be planted by agents operating deep within enemy territory, and that would cause maximum disruption to German war production. One of their most ingenious creations was designed specifically to destroy machinery from within. It resembled an innocuous piece of industrial equipment, perhaps a replacement part or a component. It could be smuggled into a factory, incorporated into a submarine, under construction, and would only reveal its true nature when it was far too late. The principles behind these sabotage devices varied. Some were designed to cause immediate catastrophic failure. Others were engineered to induce gradual deterioration, weakening critical systems in ways that would only become apparent under operational stress. Imagine a bearing that functioned perfectly during dockyard tests, but began to fail under the pressure of deep diving. Consider a seal that held water at shallow depths, but gave way when the submarine descended to escape Allied hunters. Picture a weld that looked sound during inspection but contained microscopic flaws introduced by a saboteur, flaws that would crack and split when subjected to the shock of nearby depth charge explosions. The genius of this approach lay in its deniability. When a U-boat failed to return from patrol, the German Navy had no way of knowing whether it had been sunk by enemy action or had suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. Submarines operating in the deep ocean left no witnesses. If a pressure hull cracked at 400 feet below the surface, the vessel would be crushed instantly by the weight of the water above. The crew would be eliminated in seconds, and the wreckage would scatter across the seabed, destroying any evidence of sabotage. The Germans would attribute the loss to enemy action, to bad luck, or to the inherent dangers of submarine warfare. They would not suspect that their own shipyards had been compromised. To understand how these operations worked, we must examine the structure of German submarine production. By 1942, U-boats were being constructed at multiple shipyards across Germany and occupied territories. Major production centers included the Deschimag Yard in Bremen, the Blom und Voss facility in Hamburg, the Germania Werft in Kiel, and the Deutsche Werft, also in Hamburg. Each of these yards employed thousands of workers, not all of whom were Germans. The Nazi war economy relied heavily on forced labor, conscripted workers from occupied countries who toiled under brutal conditions in German factories. Among these workers were individuals who had every reason to resist and who would prove willing to risk their lives for the chance to strike back at their oppressors. SOE established networks for reaching these workers. Agents were infiltrated into the German industrial system through elaborate cover stories. Resistance contacts in occupied countries identified sympathizers within the shipyard workforces. Materials were smuggled along carefully constructed supply routes, hidden in shipments of legitimate goods, concealed in the belongings of workers commuting across borders. The logistics were extraordinarily complex, requiring coordination across multiple countries and the maintenance of absolute security. A single betrayal could unravel entire networks and send dozens of agents to their deaths in Gestapo interrogation cells. The sabotage materials themselves required special design considerations. They needed to be small enough to conceal, durable enough to survive transport, and effective enough to cause significant damage. SOE's Station 12, the organization's research and development facility at Aston House in Hertfordshire, produced a remarkable array of such devices. One category involved abrasives, fine metallite grits that could be introduced into lubricating systems. Once inside an engine or gearbox, these particles would cause accelerated wear, gradually destroying precision components. The damage would appear to be normal mechanical failure, attributable to manufacturing defects or poor maintenance. Another approach involved specialized incendiaries. These were designed to ignite only under specific conditions, such as exposure to seawater or extreme pressure. A device hidden within electrical wiring could remain dormant for weeks, activating only when the submarine was submerged and its electrical systems were under load. The resulting fire would be catastrophic in the confined spaces of a submarine, spreading toxic smoke through the vessel and forcing the crew to surface in the midst of enemy-controlled waters, or simply eliminating everyone aboard before they could react. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating sabotage involved the submarine's pressure hull itself. Every U-boat crew member understood that their survival depended on the integrity of that hull. It was their protection against the crushing weight of the ocean, the thin barrier between life and death. German submarine construction involved thousands of welds joining steel plates together. Each weld had to be perfect. A single weak point could become a catastrophic failure under pressure. SOE developed methods for compromising these welds during construction, introducing impurities or creating stress concentrations that would remain invisible during inspection, but would fail under operational conditions. Resistance workers in the shipyards became saboteurs. They worked under constant surveillance, surrounded by Gestapo informers and Nazi Party loyalists. The punishment for sabotage was death, often preceded by torture to extract the names of accomplices. Yet men and women continued to volunteer for these missions, understanding that each act of sabotage might save Allied lives, might shorten the war, might bring liberation closer for their occupied homelands. They worked with trembling hands, concealing their activities behind masks of obedience, waiting for the moments when a supervisor turned away or a shift change created confusion. A welder might deliberately create a cold joint, a weld that appeared solid but had not properly fused with the base metal. An electrician might route a cable through an area subject to abrasion, ensuring that insulation would eventually wear through. A machinist might introduce a slight dimensional error in a critical component, one that would cause excessive vibration under load. Each of these actions was tiny in isolation, but cumulatively they created a pattern of unreliability that plagued German submarine operations. The results of this shadow campaign are difficult to quantify with precision. The Germans themselves never fully understood what was happening. Post-war analysis of Kriegsmarine records reveals a troubling pattern of mechanical failures, unexplained losses, and submarines that developed serious problems shortly after entering service. Some of these issues can be attributed to the declining quality of German industry as the war progressed, to shortages of skilled workers and critical materials, but others bear the hallmarks of deliberate sabotage, failures too convenient and too strategically timed to be coincidental. Consider the case of U-boats that disappeared on their first operational patrol. A newly constructed submarine would complete its dockyard trials, pass all inspections, and depart for its assigned patrol area. Days or weeks later, it would simply vanish, never reporting back, never engaging any known Allied forces. No distress signal, no survivors, no wreckage found. The German Navy would mark it as lost to unknown causes and order another vessel to take its place. How many of these losses were due to enemy action, and how many were caused by time-delayed sabotage devices activated long after the submarine had left its protected harbor? This is a good moment to pause and remind you that if you're enjoying this deep dive into the shadow war beneath the waves, please consider liking and sharing this video. Your engagement helps these untold stories reach a wider audience. The British were not alone in this effort. Resistance movements across occupied Europe contributed to the campaign against U-boat production. Norwegian resistance fighters targeted the transportation of components along the Norwegian coast. Danish saboteurs attacked facilities that produced specialized submarine equipment. French networks disrupted the supply of critical materials to the submarine pens on the Atlantic coast. Dutch workers in German shipyards passed intelligence about construction schedules and security arrangements. This was a pan-European effort coordinated by SOE but powered by the courage of thousands of individuals who refused to accept Nazi occupation. One particularly effective technique involved the sabotage of component suppliers. U-boats required precision instruments, specialized materials, and carefully manufactured parts. Disrupting the supply chain could have effects far beyond a single submarine. If a batch of defective periscope optics entered the supply system, multiple vessels might be affected. If torpedo gyroscopes were subtly miscalibrated, an entire production run of weapons might become unreliable. The Germans had created an interconnected industrial machine, but that interconnection also created vulnerabilities. A single successful sabotage operation at a key supplier could ripple outward through the entire submarine production system. Battery production was a particularly attractive target. German submarines used large banks of lead-acid batteries for underwater propulsion. These batteries were heavy, dangerous, and absolutely essential. They released hydrogen gas during charging, creating an explosion risk that demanded careful ventilation. They contained sulfuric acid that could cause horrific injuries if spilled, and they were manufactured at a limited number of specialized facilities. Resistance networks targeted these plants with both conventional sabotage and more subtle techniques designed to reduce battery performance without triggering immediate detection. A U-boat with degraded batteries would have reduced underwater endurance, forcing it to surface more frequently and exposing it to Allied aircraft and surface ships. The psychological dimension of this campaign should not be underestimated. As the war progressed, German submarine crews became aware that something was wrong. Mechanical failures that should have been rare became disturbingly common. Equipment that had been reliable in earlier years now malfunctioned at critical moments. Veterans who had survived dozens of patrols noticed the decline. Rumors spread through the Kriegsmarine about sabotage in the shipyards, about traitors in the workforce, about enemies within. This uncertainty eroded morale. Crews departing on patrol no longer had complete confidence in their vessels. That psychological burden added to the already tremendous stress of submarine warfare, contributing to errors in judgment and failures of nerve. The German security apparatus responded with increasing paranoia. The Gestapo intensified surveillance of shipyard workers. Foreign laborers were subjected to additional restrictions and scrutiny. Production schedules slowed as inspection procedures became more rigorous. Resources that could have been devoted to building submarines were instead consumed by security measures. This was another form of victory for the sabotage campaign. Even when individual operations failed or went undetected, the overall effect was to reduce German submarine production efficiency and divert enemy resources from offensive operations. Among the most dramatic sabotage operations were those targeting submarines during their fitting-out period. After a U-boat's hull was complete and launched, it would spend weeks alongside the dock being equipped with its weapons, sensors, and operational equipment. During this period, the vessel was particularly vulnerable. It was not yet fully crewed, security was sometimes less stringent than for operational boats, and there were numerous opportunities to access critical systems. SOE trained agents specifically for operations during this window, briefing them on submarine layouts and identifying the most vulnerable targets. One documented technique involved the placement of delayed-action explosive charges in fuel tanks or ballast spaces. These devices would be concealed during the fitting-out period and would only detonate after the submarine had been at sea for a predetermined interval. The explosion would occur far from any witnesses, in international waters where the cause of loss could never be determined. The charge did not even need to be large. A properly placed small explosion could crack pressure hull welds or rupture fuel lines, initiating a cascade of failures that would doom the vessel. Another approach targeted the submarine's torpedoes. German torpedoes were complex weapons, precision instruments that had to function perfectly after spending weeks in storage tubes exposed to the vibration, pressure changes, and temperature variations of submarine operations. Sabotage during torpedo manufacture or loading could render these weapons ineffective or even dangerous to their users. There were reports of German torpedoes running in circles, returning to strike the submarine that had launched them. While some of these incidents resulted from genuine mechanical failures in early war torpedo designs, others may have been the result of deliberate interference. The coal bomb deserves particular mention as one of SOE's most ingenious inventions. This device was disguised as an ordinary lump of coal. When shoveled into a ship's furnace along with legitimate fuel, it would explode with devastating force, destroying boilers and potentially sinking the vessel. While coal bombs were primarily used against surface ships, the principle extended to U-boat support vessels, to the tugs and tenders that serviced submarines in harbor, and to the training facilities where new crews learned their deadly trade. Every coal bunker in occupied Europe became a potential hiding place for these weapons. The long-term strategic impact of the sabotage campaign extended beyond individual U-boats destroyed. The German Navy was forced to implement increasingly elaborate quality control procedures, slowing production at a time when quantity was desperately needed. Skilled workers were diverted from construction to inspection. Trust between management and workforce eroded. The industrial machine that had produced submarines with remarkable efficiency in the early years of the war began to stutter and slow. By 1944, German submarine production was a shadow of what it had been, and reliability problems plagued the boats that did enter service. Admiral Dönitz and his staff never fully grasped the extent of the sabotage problem. German security mentality focused on grand conspiracies, on networks of spies transmitting intelligence to the enemy. The idea that individual workers, acting alone or in tiny cells, could systematically undermine submarine production through countless small acts of sabotage did not fit their conception of resistance. They looked for dramatic operations and missed the quiet, persistent erosion of their industrial capacity. This blindness was itself a victory for the Allied sabotage campaign. The human cost of this shadow war was enormous. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of resistance workers and SOE agents were captured, tortured, and executed by the Gestapo. Their names largely remain unknown, their sacrifices unrecorded. They died in the cells of German prisons, in the camps of the Nazi concentration system, or simply disappeared without trace. For every successful operation, there were failed attempts, blown covers, betrayals, and captures. The men and women who fought this war knew the odds against them and persisted anyway. Some operations became legendary even during the war. The attack on the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire, Operation Chariot, was designed specifically to deny the German Navy a facility capable of repairing their largest surface warships. While not directly targeting U-boats, it demonstrated the lengths to which British commandos would go to strike at German naval capacity. Other operations remained secret throughout the war and for decades afterward, their details locked in classified files to protect networks that might be needed again in future conflicts. The Norwegian heavy water sabotage operations, while aimed at disrupting the German nuclear program, employed similar techniques and demonstrated the capabilities of resistance networks operating in occupied territory. Trained operatives, working with local resistance fighters, penetrated heavily defended facilities and destroyed critical equipment. These operations proved that even the most secure German installations were vulnerable to determined saboteurs with proper training and support. As the war turned against Germany, the sabotage campaign intensified. More workers were recruited into resistance networks. More devices were smuggled into German industrial facilities. The declining morale of the German workforce created new opportunities for recruitment and new vulnerabilities in security procedures. Workers who had been too frightened to resist in 1942 found their courage in 1944, when Allied victories made German defeat seem possible and then inevitable. The flow of information from inside German shipyards increased, enabling more precisely targeted operations. The final months of the war saw a strange inversion. German industry was now producing advanced submarine designs, vessels like the Type 21 that represented significant technological leaps forward. These boats were faster underwater than any previous design, capable of remaining submerged for extended periods, and equipped with sophisticated sensors and weapons. They represented a potential renewal of the U-boat threat. But production was plagued by problems. Components did not arrive on schedule. Assembled vessels failed their trials. The industrial machine that was supposed to produce these wonder weapons in sufficient numbers to change the course of the war was crippled by bombing, material shortages, and the accumulated effects of years of sabotage. Only 2 Type 21 submarines completed operational patrols before Germany's surrender. Despite German claims that hundreds would enter service, the production system simply could not deliver. How much of this failure was due to Allied bombing? How much to material shortages? And how much to sabotage remains debated by historians. The answer is almost certainly that all 3 factors contributed, interacting in complex ways that made the total effect greater than the sum of its parts. The sabotage campaign was never intended to win the war by itself. It was one component of a comprehensive strategy that included surface operations, aerial campaigns, code-breaking, and conventional combat. The lessons learned from the anti-U-boat sabotage campaign influenced subsequent thinking about unconventional warfare. The techniques developed by SOE were studied and refined by successor organizations in the post-war era. The concept of attacking an enemy's industrial capacity through infiltration and sabotage rather than direct assault became a cornerstone of Cold War planning. In a nuclear age when conventional bombing might trigger catastrophic escalation, the ability to wage shadow warfare against enemy production gained new relevance. Modern naval warfare continues to grapple with the vulnerabilities that the Second World War exposed. Submarines remain among the most lethal weapon systems in existence, capable of threatening entire fleets and disrupting global trade. But they also remain vulnerable to the factors that doomed so many U-boats. A submarine is only as reliable as its components. A leak in the wrong place, a failure of a critical system at the wrong moment can transform a powerful weapon into a steel coffin. The lessons of the sabotage campaign remind us that the most sophisticated technology can be defeated by small acts of resistance, by individuals who refuse to accept their role as cogs in an enemy's machine. If this story has moved you, if you want to ensure that more of these forgotten chapters of history are brought to light, now is the moment to subscribe. Press the bell for notifications and you will never miss an upload. The survivors of the Sabotage campaign, those few who lived to see the end of the war, mostly returned to ordinary lives. They did not speak of what they had done. Many were bound by secrecy oaths that remained in effect for decades. Others simply wanted to forget, to leave behind the fear and the guilt and the memories of comrades lost. The stories emerged slowly, pieced together by historians from declassified documents, from deathbed confessions, from the careful analysis of German wartime records. What emerges from this reconstruction is a portrait of extraordinary courage exercised in circumstances of extreme danger. These were not soldiers in uniform, protected by the laws of war and the camaraderie of their units. They were isolated individuals operating alone or in tiny groups, surrounded by enemies, knowing that capture meant torture and death. They persisted for months and years, maintaining their covers, carrying out their missions, passing intelligence, and smuggling materials, never knowing when a knock on the door might signal the end. The U-boat campaign that almost brought Britain to its knees was defeated by multiple factors: improved convoy tactics, better-trained escort crews, long-range aircraft, enhanced radar and sonar, code-breaking breakthroughs that revealed U-boat positions, and eventually overwhelming Allied production capacity all played crucial roles. The Sabotage campaign was one thread in this tapestry of victory. It cannot claim sole credit for defeating the U-boats, but it made a contribution that was both materially significant and symbolically powerful. It demonstrated that Nazi Germany's vaunted industrial machine was not invulnerable, that resistance was possible even in the heart of the enemy's homeland, and that the courage of individuals could shape the course of history. The submarines that sank with their crews, victims of failed welds and sabotaged components, rest now on the floor of the Atlantic. Their steel hulls are slowly rusting away, becoming artificial reefs that host new forms of life. The men who served aboard them are long dead, as are most of the saboteurs who helped send them to their graves. But the story endures. It speaks to us across the decades about the nature of resistance, about the power of the individual against the machine, and about the hidden dimensions of total war. Not all battles are fought with guns and bombs. Some are fought with wire cutters and soldering irons, with forged documents and whispered messages, with the quiet courage of those who chose to fight back in the only ways available to them. The British sabotage weapon that destroyed German U-boats from the inside was not a single device or a single operation. It was a campaign, a network, a sustained effort that lasted throughout the war. It combined technical ingenuity with human courage, industrial expertise with espionage tradecraft. Its exact toll on German submarine forces can never be precisely calculated, but its impact was real and significant. In the shadow war beneath the waves, victory belonged to those who understood that the most powerful weapon is not always the one that makes the loudest noise. As we reflect on this hidden chapter of the Second World War, we should remember those who fought in the darkness, the SOE operatives who parachuted into occupied territory knowing they might never return, the resistance workers who risked everything to place a single, sabotaged component, the scientists and engineers who developed weapons that could not be publicly celebrated, the support personnel who maintained the supply lines and communications networks. All of them contributed to a victory that was as much about industrial capacity and covert operations as it was about battlefield heroics. The Battle of the Atlantic was won in the shipyards and factories as surely as it was won on the open ocean. The submarines that failed to sail, the patrols that ended in unexplained disaster, the mechanical problems that forced boats to return to port, all contributed to the attrition that gradually wore down the Kriegsmarine's submarine arm. By war's end, Germany had lost nearly 800 U-boats and approximately 30,000 submarine crew members. Not all of these losses can be attributed to sabotage, but the campaign contributed to a pattern of unreliability that made the U-boat threat more manageable than it might otherwise have been. The story of this shadow war carries lessons that remain relevant in the modern era. As nations develop ever more sophisticated weapon systems, they also create new vulnerabilities. Supply chains stretch across continents. Components are manufactured in multiple countries. Software controls critical functions. Each node in this network represents a potential point of attack for those with the skill and determination to exploit it. The principles that guided SOE's campaign against U-boat production have not become obsolete. They have evolved and adapted to new technologies and new threats. History remembers the great battles, the decisive engagements, the commanders who led armies to victory. It less often remembers the quiet contributions of those who worked in shadows, whose names never appeared in headlines, whose sacrifices were known only to a few. The sabotage campaign against German U-boats represents one such overlooked chapter. It deserves to be remembered, studied, and honored as an integral part of the Allied victory in the Second World War. The cold waters of the Atlantic still hold their secrets. Somewhere on that vast ocean floor, scattered across thousands of miles, lie the remains of submarines that never returned. Some were sunk by depth charges and torpedoes. Others met their end through causes that will never be fully explained. Among them are vessels that carried within their hulls the seeds of their own destruction, planted by hands that would never know the fate they had set in motion. Those anonymous saboteurs achieved something remarkable. They struck at the enemy in his most protected places, turned his own industry against him, and helped secure a victory that seemed impossible in the darkest days of the war. Their weapon was not one of steel and explosives alone. It was cunning, patience, and the unconquerable human spirit.